Hi everyone, I'm Leanne and this is Unschooled History. I'm doing this one alone today because this is one of my specialty areas, being part of the medieval world. And today we are talking about 7 things you weren't taught about the plague in school and 5 things we have today because of it. But first, a quick overview. So, the Black Death or the plague was actually the second big round of it that struck Europe. And this time around, it came from China via the Silk Road through India and the Middle East and into Italy, where it spread to the rest of Europe. There are actually 3 different types of plague. One is the septicemic plague. It affects your bloodstream, there's no treatment, and it has a 100% mortality rate. The second type of plague is the pneumonic plague. It's very much like regular pneumonia. It has a somewhat higher rate of death than bubonic plague, but it's still very treatable. The third type is the bubonic plague. It is the most famous of the 3 plagues. It's the one that we learned about. It's the one we call the Black Death. All 3 are caused by a bacteria called Y. pestis. And what it does is it blocks a flea's gut and it causes the flea to regurgitate. The flea will then regurgitate this infection into its host, and for much of the early Middle Ages, that host was rats, but the rats began dropping dead, and so the fleas had to pick a new host. And of course, that host all too often was a human being. The first cool thing that you probably weren't taught much about in school was the plague stones. In this case, the vinegar stones. I know I wasn't taught about these, and I think they're really neat. Um, and what happened was, just like today with COVID-19, they were practicing social distancing. Markets were shut down, but you still had to get the goods from the farms and into the city. So what they would do is the people would place their orders with the farmers. They would drop their coins into these stones, which were hollowed out and filled with vinegar. They would then retreat to a safe distance. The farmer would then come up, leave the produce or whatever it was that had been ordered from them, and they would retrieve the coins from inside the vinegar. The person would then wait until the farmer had retreated to a safe distance, and then they would come up and retrieve their order. The second thing that you might not have learned about was plague crosses. Some were of stone. They were either used similar to the vinegar stones or as part of open air altars, such as the one on the top left. It was part of an open air altar in Italy. Others served as memorials to the dead and marked sites of mass burial pits. And that was what the one on the bottom center did. On the right, you have yet a third type of plague cross. And what it is the cross was actually painted onto the door, and it marked the home where somebody was infected with the plague. And nobody could enter the house, and nobody could leave the house until that cross was removed by the authorities, who were 100% positive that plague no longer was in the home. The third thing that we are discussing today is the plague doctor outfit. You see it at Renaissance festivals all the time. It looks a little silly, but there is evidence that it did, in fact, offer some protection, which makes a lot of sense. After all, with the exception of the staff and the herbs and flowers that filled the mask, medical professionals are still using many of these things in another form today. Anytime that you see a doctor or nurse in surgery in a hospital, they are wearing a hairnet. They are wearing masks. They are wearing gloves. They are always wearing scrubs, whether they're in surgery or just working in the hospital. Usually nurses are wearing scrubs in a doctor's office. Very often in surgery, the doctor will also be wearing a apron or something over his scrubs. And this all came from the plague doctor outfit. It had a wide-brimmed hat, a bird beak mask stuffed with flowers and herbs, and really the whole purpose of it being in the bird beak form was because that gave them plenty of room to breathe while still allowing for the flowers and the herbs to be stuffed in it, because they believed that the plague was caused by bad air or miasma. They had glass eyes in the masks so that the doctor could see. They had the protective overcoat. They had the leather gloves. And they had a staff for keeping people away, for removing clothes, for examining people without touching them, and for pointing things out. Once again, they were masters of social distancing. And just like CDC regulations today with COVID-19, the plague doctor preferred to keep people at least 6 feet away from him, which is very interesting that we had something back then that is still considered common sense today. The fourth thing that you didn't learn in school is that we have the plague to thank for the use of literature purely for entertainment, especially for sex comedies. Before this, literature and plays always had a moral of or lesson. But then came the Decameron, an Italian text that inspired the Canterbury Tales, as well as Shakespeare and Tennyson and artists such as Waterhouse and Botticelli. And it was one of the first stories to frame a story within a story. And what it is about is a bunch of people who are stuck in an Italian villa in the countryside during the plague, and they keep themselves entertained by telling each other stories. And some of them were kind of raunchy, which is not all that surprising if you think about it. Sex jokes are not a modern invention. They have been popular for hundreds and hundreds of years, and so you often had stories like this to help entertain each other, and this is really the first time that these stories were written down, all fitting various themes. So now we come to an image of a mass grave, and the skeleton on the right is 4,900 years old. It is a woman from a Neolithic farming community, and Y. pestis was found in the pulp of her teeth. They found it in the pulp of her teeth. This was found in Northern Europe, and it showed that Y. pestis was actually around in Northern Europe before there was migration from the steppes and from the east into Europe. So even though the second round of plague started in China, the very first round of the plague got its start right there in Northern Europe. And they also found it in the teeth of one of her male companions there in the tomb. And it's just really interesting because that's 1,000 years earlier than it was first thought to arrive in Europe, and it completely changed the timeline of the plague itself. Interestingly enough, they didn't call it the Black Death at the time. Despite the symptoms, despite the black bubules, they didn't call it the Black Death. They called it the Pestilence, or the Great Mortality, which is way creepier sounding. The Great Mortality. It sounds kind of epic, doesn't it? But that was what they called it back then. Now, here's the seventh thing that you probably had no clue about. I know I didn't. I was so surprised by this. But it turns out that one of the earliest plague doctors was Michel de Nostradamus. Yes, the same guy who is famous for his quatrains, supposedly foretelling the future, was originally a plague doctor. Actually, he was originally a apothecary. And he actually studied at the University of Avignon in France, but had to leave after over just a year because the university closed because of an outbreak of plague. So he became an apothecary before entering the University of Montpellier, hoping to earn a doctorate, but because he was working as an apothecary and they found out, they expelled him. So he went right back to working as an apothecary, and he actually became somewhat famous for creating a rose pill that purportedly protected against the plague. And I can understand why that might actually help, because rose petals have vitamin C in them. Today, you might use rose water in a more exotic recipe. Maybe that's a less exotic recipe, depending on what part of the world you live in or what your culture is. Maybe you have eaten candied rose petals. I know I've made them for Michael. He loves them. But rose petals contain a lot of vitamin C in them. And of course, vitamin C, as we know, improves your immune system. So it is possible that his rose pills did help somewhat. And after his wife and 2 children died, presumably from the plague again, he continued to travel around and found a prominent physician named Louis Serre and helped him in his fight against yet another major plague outbreak in Marseille. And then he went and tackled another outbreak on his own in Salon de Provence and in the regional capital, Aix-en-Provence. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I really do. So there you go. Nostradamus, before he got into occultism and before he became known for his quatrains, was actually a plague doctor. Before we move on to things that we still have today because of the plague, let's talk about Ring Around the Rosie. There is a persistent myth that has been around since the mid-20th century that Ring Around the Rosie originated with the Black Plague. And that's just so very wrong. It is very, very wrong. The song originated in the 19th century, and according to Games and Songs of American Children, published in 1883, the falling down at the end was a curtsy or a bow, and the Rosie was a reference to the French word for rose tree, and was the title given to the child in the center, to whom all the children would bow or curtsy. And whoever bowed or curtsied the slowest would then become the rose tree in the center for the next round. So it really did not have anything to do with the plague. In fact, the modern lyrics don't even really reflect the symptoms of the plague that well. Also, the lyrics have gone through a lot of changes over the past couple hundred years. And it's just changed so much that it's hard to imagine that anyone would believe that it actually came from the Black Death. So now we're on to the 5 things we still have from the Black Death. Thanks to COVID-19, social distancing is a thing again, but it started in the Middle Ages. They were social distancing before it was cool. So now I guess we can just imagine little hipster monks and hipster, honey, what is the word for somebody who's hiding away?
Hermit?
Yes, hipster hermits. And of course, we have quarantine and isolation in case of pandemics too. That got started because of the plague. Introverts like us are joking that we haven't seen much of a change in our daily lives. Quarantine, of course, comes from the Italian for 40, in a reference to the 40 days that ships were kept from unloading in order to ensure that nobody aboard was sick. Also, we have great poetry thanks to the plague. I mentioned before that we got literature for fun thanks to the Black Death. Well, they also shut down the theaters, leaving theater troops to travel out in the districts and hope that they got out there before illness and before word of an outbreak did. To help make ends meet, a lot of playwrights like Shakespeare would turn to writing poetry. And it is because of one particular outbreak in the plague in the early 1600s that we have 2 of his longest poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece. It was also during this time that Dante Alighieri was writing his Divine Comedy. From left to right, we have illustration panels from Dante's Inferno, which is the most famous of the 3, as well as Purgatorio and Paradiso. For the past 20 years or so, aromatherapy has been extremely popular. Again, we got it from the Black Plague. We got it from the Black Death because, like I said earlier, they thought that it came from bad air. They were stuffing masks with herbs and flowers. They were using a lot more perfume because they thought that bathing was bad. And aromatherapy survives to this day and is now popular again. While we know now that sickness is caused by viruses and bacteria, there's no denying that certain aromas can be very calming or pleasurable. And I looked it up, and according to WebMD, aromatherapy has actually been found to be very helpful for stress, for anxiety, for depression, and even some joint pain, especially joint pain from rheumatoid arthritis. But perhaps the most important thing that we have today, thanks to the plague, is an improved immune system for everyone. It was those with the strongest immune systems that survived the plague and went on to reproduce. Now, here's the thing. White pestis is still around today. We still have to deal with the plague. This map is from the CDC with the information coming from the World Health Organization. And there's a dot in the center of each country where the plague was found in 2018, the most recent data that I could find. Yes, there's a dot in the United States. We get plague outbreaks in the southwestern part of the U.S. Fortunately, we don't have to worry as much as 600 or 700 years ago because modern antibiotics can take care of Y. pestis very easily. I said it before and I will say it again. The only one we have to worry about is septicemic plague when it gets into your blood. But if we are talking about the bubonic plague, like the Black Death, our modern antibiotics are going to take care of that. I really hope that you have enjoyed learning about the Black Death today. If you have, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And if there is something from history that you want to know more about and you'd like to see us cover one of these days, drop a line in the comments section.